The Taliban is gaining ground across key districts in Afghanistan, while the US is moving ahead with the pullback of the military forces from the war-torn country. We try to better understand what awaits the Kabul government in the face of rising Taliban activities. Our correspondent Susan Teherani spoke to Jason Campbell, who is a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Listen in to this conversation.
First and foremost is the viability of the Afghan National Security Forces and their ability to stem the momentum that we're clearly seeing in many parts of the country, and the degree to which they're able to repel what we're seeing is an increasingly assertive Taliban plan. The other thing here to keep in mind too is that, more broadly speaking, is the political question in terms of the Afghan government and how cohesive it will remain in the face of this oncoming pressure.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently said the status quo is not an option, and we will pull out U.S. troops regardless of what's happening in Afghanistan. Has the United States achieved its goals?
Oh, certainly not. If you look at how they were articulated over the years. I think the hopes of the U.S. was, and that of much of the international community, was to have at least a somewhat stable political order in place, supported by, again, viable security forces that were able to repel internal attacks. I think what we're finding now is that, unfortunately, the political elite never were able to fully coalesce into a unified governing entity, and have spent much of the past 10 plus years squabbling amongst themselves as the insurgency steadily became stronger, and as we're seeing today, more assertive. And despite U.S. support and persistent prodding, the United States was never able to form the necessary political unity in Kabul, and thus its military efforts were always limited in what they could ultimately accomplish.
In your opinion, is the situation any better than the 1990s, given the surge in violence right now?
A situation akin to the 90s is unfortunately not completely off the table, but that is not what we're seeing right now, as you still do have a general cohesion among the Afghan security forces, at least for the time being. Another key difference now is that the international community is much more engaged in Afghanistan than it was in the 1990s, where only a very few regional actors, in particular Pakistan and a few others, were really involved in the day-to-day actions in Kabul and throughout Afghanistan. Right now, you've got an international community that is still very much engaged, even if it doesn't have the military presence it once did.
How about the Taliban? It seems like they have a strategy, considering how they've been coming out recently with these statements to call on people and countries to join and unite.
For a number of years now, have proven very skilled propagandists and messengers. I think that this is very much in line with that and their sort of standard desire to form an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan. Such outreach, I think, has been fairly common periodically over the years.
And this strategy that they've been having, which you mentioned has been going on for a number of years, have they always tried to somewhat win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people? In these recent statements, it seems that Sirajuddin Haqqani has now come out with instructions for the Taliban military to be more gentle, for lack of a better word, regarding civilians and others in Afghanistan, despite the fact that it's also conquering swaths of land.
This is not the first time the Taliban leadership has issued statements to, be sure to treat civilians appropriately. And in fact, in previous cases, this is such announcements have usually come after a period of Taliban aggressiveness, where they were looking more to take territory, and there were increasing reports of how the Taliban were perhaps mistreating some of the civilians and others that were in the crossfire, so to speak. So it's, again, not the first time this has happened, but oftentimes the rhetoric of the Taliban doesn't quite match what you see in their actions on the ground.
Why do you think the U.S. is so adamant in withdrawing its forces, its limited amount of forces?
This is, on the political side of things, I think the Biden administration was placed in a very precarious position when it took office in late January, given that the Trump administration had a signed agreement with the Taliban with a very firm and defined end date for the U.S. presence, being in early May. This literally provided them only a number of weeks to really consider other alternatives before coming up with the somewhat hybrid decision they ultimately did, where they bought a few more months to get forces out, but largely are continuing to abide by the agreement, and really to do anything much beyond that, I think would have required a lot of political capital on the behalf of the Biden administration if they were going to enter into a phase that might even be more escalatory, given that the Taliban, by the word of the agreement, would have some justification in increasing attacks against U.S. personnel and interests within Afghanistan.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.